Wonderful. And just on time. Just on time.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we did have a little trouble with our live webcast. That's been the delay, but I think we're playing it right, so we'll get started.
Oh, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we get started? Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program. It's a real thrill for us to be here. I apologize for the late start. We've had a couple challenges getting our live webcast going, so we've delayed just a moment for that. But I think we're doing okay now. I want to welcome you to a discussion that we've entitled Harnessing the Demographic Dividend, Lessons from the World Development Report 2007. These, as you know, World Development Reports have been very influential and very useful reports that really set an agenda in the development world. And the 2007 is one that, with its focus on youth and demographic issues, in particular, and connecting them to development and economic issues, really provide a lot of fodder for discussion for the group that we have here today, and really for some of the folks we've had in regular dialogue and exchange here at the Wilson Center. For those of you who may be new to the center, just allow me a moment to put our discussions in context. Wilson Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy institute that's trying to bring the worlds of scholarship and policy together, a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis. Environmental Change and Security Program, we've been around 13 years. The center's been around since 1968. But we've been around 13 years trying to bring together the issues of health, population, development, environmental issues, and understand them in the broader development context, foreign policy context, and at times security context as well. And so we do that with meetings like this, some of the publications that I hope you will avail yourself of outside, and really trying to have this exchange that is both informing us of the best new scholarly work, and particularly then bring that together with the worlds of policymakers and practitioners, which I think with our panelists today and our discussion on today is an excellent example of how folks at the bank really spend a lot of time on the analytical side and then translate it and put it in ways that are useful for the practitioner and the policymaker. So it's terrific that we're able to have this discussion today. And just in the category just-in-time delivery, some overview documents have been brought, and so we'll make sure that you all get a copy of those as well for the discussion. We're very pleased to have both David Lamb and Mattias Lundberg to kick off our discussion today. David is going to go first. He's professor in the Department of Economics and research professor in the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan, a real locus for work in this area. We've been lucky to collaborate with the University of Michigan in a number of instances, so we know it's a real strength of that university to focus on these issues. He's been the director of the Population Studies Center there for nearly a decade, director of the Michigan Center on Demography and Aging, also a past member of the Board of Directors of Population Association of America and a member of the Committee on Population at U.S. National Academy of Sciences. So really has sat on a number of boards and positions to really see some of these topics evolve, and it's terrific that he's able to come and share his insights that he has shared on a regular basis with practitioner organizations such as the bank and UN and parts of the U.S. national government as well. Mattias is senior economist in the World Bank's research department, been a critical part of the team in preparing this report. He's agricultural economist by training and worked most recently on issues of income distribution, impact valuation, health sector reform. One of the principal authors of the Poverty and Social Impact Assessment Guidebook, and recently completed a toolkit on public expenditure reviews and human development. So we're thrilled to have him come share his insights from working inside the process. I know David was also critical in submitting some of the research upon which this report was done. So we really have two people who are integral to the topic and integral to this particular product that's under discussion. Before we get started, just two other words. One, a word of thanks to USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, which makes many of the meetings that we do at the Environmental Change and Security Program possible. Today's meeting in particular, with this focus on poverty, equity, and reproductive health, is a product of many discussions with Mai Hijazi, and it's terrific that Mai is here. And as always, Heather DeAgnes, who is our point of contact, who sends her apologies, but I think is watching online, which is particularly why I wanted to get the online to work. She's homesick today, unfortunately. So it's terrific that those folks are here. And then finally, because we are webcasting this live, and then we'll have the video archived on the website along with the slides and a summary of the meeting. When we come to the Q&A, I ask that you wait until one of my colleagues brings you a microphone so you can tell us your name and where you're coming from, but most importantly, it can capture the audio of your question so that folks online can hear what you're asking. So, David, I think we'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. It's great to be here. Find myself here. My role in the WDR was to provide one of the background papers, and I wanted to go first because Mattias can give you the kind of official World Bank presentation about the WDR. My inputs were really on the demography of youth. I was also involved in the National Academy of Sciences panel on growing up global that also looked at similar issues and had some influence, I think, on the WDR report. And our concern there was partly motivated, that grew out of the Committee on Population, which I was a member of, and so not surprisingly, part of our motivation in doing that Growing Up Global report was, in fact, the demography of youth. And that's what I want to talk about. There's various ways of thinking about it. One is that you hear references to the youth bulge, which is what I've used in my title, which is directly related to the demographic dividend and the window of opportunity and the demographic bonus and various dimensions of kind of the same basic demographic phenomenon which I want to talk about. So the questions I want to look at are, why is the world currently experiencing a youth bulge, and in what sense? What are the important demographic features of the youth population in developing countries? In particular, there's kind of three things I want to try to talk about: the absolute numbers, the relative size, and growth rates, which from an economic point of view, we could imagine each of these having particular important implications. I think it's important in understanding youth in developing countries today to understand the demography that sort of produced them, because there's a number of important aspects about them besides their large numbers that are related to sort of the demography that got us here. And then I want to talk a little bit about the economic implications of these demographic trends. This is a graph of the population aged 12 to 24. That's the age group that the World Bank team used for the World Development Report. So that's what I've used, and these were some of these graphs appear in various forms in the WDR. The population age 12 to 24 for the world as a whole, you can see is sort of reaching a peak. It's kind of a complicated peak. It sort of peaks about here. This is 2005, kind of flattens out and goes up a little bit. But it's approximately true that we're seeing the largest number of young people that the world will ever see, which is kind of interesting. There's 1.5 billion people in this 12 to 24 age group in the world today, approximately, and 1.3 billion of them are in developing countries. Now, we see very different patterns across regions. If we look at Asia, we see really the true kind of youth bulge in its extreme, in the sense that we're really seeing right about now the largest number of young people, not just that have ever been seen, which is interesting, but arguably that will ever be seen in these countries. Latin America looks pretty similar, gets to higher levels. I should say these numbers here are relative to 1950, so I've just normalized here, so 1950 is 100. So we can see that for the world as a whole, we have about 2.5 times as many young people as we did in 1950. For Latin America, it's almost 3.5 times. So huge numerical increases, of course, going with general population growth. Now, if we want to put Africa on here, we actually have to change the scale quite a lot, and Africa continues increasing for quite some time. So the Africa picture is quite different. We're not really seeing the peak, and in fact, we're going to see continued growth of the youth population in Africa for many more decades, really out to 2050 in the UN. These are all based on United Nations medium variant projections. Now, if we in the WDR, working with the team there, we decided to kind of break this up into four stylized patterns. One pattern, which China and Thailand are typical of, and in some ways the only countries that really show it in dramatic fashion, The youth population peaked back in the around 1990, and the numbers have actually been declining for some time. And this is quite important. This means the school-age population is declining. The number of young people in secondary school needing youth services is actually declining in absolute terms, and will continue to decline for the coming decades. So this is directly a result of early and rapid fertility decline. Talk more about that in a moment. Then there's a lot of countries in this class. You can see these are mostly Latin American countries, also Indonesia, Vietnam. These are countries that have had a pretty rapid fertility decline, a little bit later than China and Thailand, but these are countries that have been well through the demographic transition now, and they're the countries that are really producing this peak in the youth population approximately now. So they're peaking right here around 2005 to 2010 and beginning to decline in the size of the youth population. A third group is a group of countries that fertility decline has been underway. It was a little bit later, a little bit slower. You can see that the youth population has been continuing to grow and is going to level off here in kind of a long period of leveling off here around 2015. So a large group of countries in this area, in this category as well. And then the fourth category is sort of the late fertility decline countries. And there we have a lot of African countries. Pakistan and Bangladesh are in here, although there's a bit of differences, Bangladesh down here. But these countries are going to have continued growth along the lines of the African pattern that I showed, continuing rapid growth of the youth population for several more decades. Okay, so we have these sort of four stylized patterns. And it leads us to the question of why these youth cohorts are so large. Now, I think it's important to answer this question for a couple of reasons. One is it's just kind of demographically interesting. But I think it's very important to sort of understand the context of kind of where these youth cohorts came from, because there's a number of important features about them. Basically, I think of these youth cohorts today as the children of the population explosion generation, by which I mean the population explosion generation could be thought of as the children born in the 1960s approximately, who experienced the increased child survival that was responsible for the rapid population growth that we saw in the 1960s. These are basically their children. So improvements in infant and child survival, as most of us know, was responsible for the rapid population growth of the 1950s, peaked around 1965. So the population growth rate for the world peaked sometime around 1962 at about 2%. Has been declining ever since, and that was really a result of massive increases in infant and child survival. That produced these very large cohorts that were born in the 1950s, 60s, into the 70s. And of course, that created a large childbearing age population 20 to 30 years later. This is what demographers call population momentum, the fact that because childbearing occurs 20 to 30 years after birth, we get a sort of wave of the childbearing population, which is going to cause population growth as those numbers hit childbearing age. Now, what we've had, of course, as well is rapid fertility decline. And basically, the size of birth cohorts from sort of 1960s onward are basically determined by a race between population momentum and falling fertility. So rising numbers of childbearing age women produced large birth cohorts. That's who produced these large youth cohorts of today. But then we had rapid fertility decline. And these really worked against each other, trying to determine the size of birth cohorts. So these large birth cohorts of today are the children of these large birth cohorts that were the high survivors of the 1960s. Now, this leads to some important points, and one of the reasons I think it's important to go back to this history is that paradoxically, these large youth cohorts today were actually born to small families relative to their parents. And I'll show you some evidence of that. So this at first seems odd. Why are there so many of them if they were born to mothers who had relatively small numbers of children? And the answer, of course, is that there were just lots of those mothers having those families. But it's an important fact about these cohorts. So here's a graph of fertility rates. This is the total fertility rate, average number of children born to a woman over her lifetime. In the 1950s, it's up here around 6 and 7. And we can see the rapid fertility decline, which most of you probably well familiar with. This is Asia and Latin America, almost right on top of each other, falling from 6 down to 2.5. Very close, many countries actually down to replacement fertility. Brazil, obviously lots of Asian countries. Even in Africa, which is a late fertility decline, the fertility decline has been substantial, down to a total fertility rate of about 5 in these data here for the 2000-2005 period. Well, that's sort of important factor driving everything here. I want to show the case of Brazil. I've worked a lot in Brazil. It has particularly good data, and I've done some papers looking at these issues of the trade-off between cohort size and family size in Brazil. This is sort of the stylized version of the demographic transition, falling birth rates and death rates. So this is the birth rate. This is a different measure than the total fertility rate. This is births per 1,000 women, but the pattern is basically the same. High in the 1950s, then begins to decline, falls quite steadily. The crude death rate was already pretty low in the 1950s. The population growth rate is just literally the difference between these two. So here with 45 per 1,000 compared to 15 per 1,000 is a difference of 30 or 3% growth. This is that difference. So this is the population growth rate, the rate of natural increase per 1,000. So the 30 means 3% per year. And it peaks here around 1960 to 65 at about 3% per year, following very much the trend of all developing countries. Now, this is important because this really explains sort of where these large cohorts come from. As I said, they're basically the children of the people born here in this period here. And then we have this rapid fertility decline. If you put those together, what you get is this interesting picture of the size of birth cohorts in Brazil. So I got quite interested working with one of my Brazilian graduate students about sort of when was the largest birth cohort born in Brazil. And the answer is 1982. This is the size of birth cohorts as measured in the census. It's actually surviving birth cohorts because we measured these around age 10, because we were actually interested in the size of the school-age population and how it's changed. And you can see there's this very rapid growth here in the size of birth cohorts, driven by this combination of increasing survival and then eventually the population momentum of increasing numbers of women of childbearing age, competing with the falling fertility. So interestingly here, fertility is already declining very fast here by the 1960s, certainly the 1970s, and yet cohorts continue to grow because of the population momentum. And why is the largest birth cohort born in 1982? Well, there's nothing particularly interesting about 1982. It just happens to be when falling fertility finally wins the race against population momentum, and we hit a peak and then begin to decline. So Brazil actually has falling absolute cohort size beginning in the 1980s, which means the school-age population began to fall in absolute numbers in the 1990s, and we were actually interested in looking at the impact of that on school enrollments. And in fact, school enrollments and school progress through school began to improve greatly in Brazil in the 1990s as the school-age population began to decline. Okay, so there's a lot of importance to the demography here, we think. This is just an age pyramid. It's just another way of seeing a representation of the youth bulge. This is these are 5-year age groups. This is sort of an approximation to the WDR's definition of youth. This is 15 to 24. And you can see here that it's is a big bulge here in Brazil, with a little bit of a twist, because then the age pyramid starts to come out again at the bottom, as in fact these people begin to have children. So there's sort of yet another echo. This group here is this largest birth cohort ever born around 1980 to 84. Now, whether they're the largest ever kind of depends on what happens, because in fact the cohorts start to go up a little bit again. But basically things are very flat here for about another 20-year period. The rapid growth of cohorts of the past will almost surely never be seen again. Contrast that to Bangladesh, I just picked as a country which is in a group of later fertility decline, and you can see that we don't get the youth bulge here. We still get continuing growth of cohorts, and the youth cohort itself, the youth age group, will continue to grow for several decades. Now, turning to the economics of all this, what difference do these things make from an economic point of view? Now, these absolute large numbers are quite staggering. 1.5 billion young people. In most countries, the largest number of young people they'll have ever seen. And these absolute numbers may be very important from an economic point of view, particularly if we think of there's some fixed factor of production like land that just can't adjust, then the absolute numbers are going to be important. But for the most part, if you think about it from an economic point of view, you start to think more about things other than absolute numbers, like, for example, the growth rate. Okay, so if you're running the school system, if you're thinking about the labor market, you may be more concerned about how fast the youth population is growing rather than just the absolute numbers. So obviously the absolute numbers have to be accommodated, but if you're the Minister of Education, you presumably can eventually get there on size. What's really hard is when the population is growing at 3% a year. That's a lot of growth to absorb in schools, in health facilities, in the labor market. Another way of thinking about it might be relative size, and this gets us to this demographic dividend, demographic bonus kind of view of the demographic transition. So the size relative to other age groups may be what's important. So we may be concerned about what's the number of young people compared to the number of working age population, the number of taxpayers. And that may be very important from an economic perspective. And the research on the demographic bonus has focused mainly on these sort of dependency ratios, the number of working age population relative to the numbers of children and elderly, for example. From the standpoint of youth in particular, there may be a lot of interest in the numbers of young people entering the labor force compared to older adult workers. And this was a big issue in the literature on the impact of the baby boom on the labor market in the U.S., for example. So if we look at these outcomes, the picture looks a bit different. This is the ratio of the 12 to 24 population to the population age 25 to 29. So sort of youth relative to number of working age population. And what we see here is that most of these countries had a peak in this ratio back here in the 1970s, 1980s. In this large group of countries, which even includes Bangladesh, a fairly late, and India, kind of later, slower fertility decline countries, this ratio has been declining now for a good 20 years. Okay. And of course, that's because of this rapid growth of sort of their parents' generation. That's really who was driving this here. This was kind of when their parents were young people relative to the older number of workers, and you had this big, very rapid increase. Today's youth cohorts, though they're big, are not really relatively big compared to the cohorts just ahead of them. It's important to see these are pretty big changes here. So this is, we're up here at 0.8, 0.9, and we drop down here to 0.4, 0.5. That means if you thought about this in terms of a tax burden, how much do you have to tax the working age population to provide secondary schools, something like that, this would literally be a 50% decline in the taxes that you need. Or, put another way, the same dollar of taxes could generate twice as much spending per pupil. So these are big changes. One way to see that is to compare it to the impact of the baby boom in the U.S. and Europe, whereas there's been a lot of research and we had a lot of interest in how these large cohorts of the baby boom affected things. And you can see here that we also experienced in the U.S. some big changes, in Europe not quite as much because they didn't have as big a baby boom. But the magnitude is quite a bit smaller. So actually about the same timing in the 1970s and 80s, we had a relatively large number of young people compared to the working age population, but never had the magnitude of what developing countries have had to experience. Now, when we get to these late fertility decline countries, like the African countries, they're only now beginning to have a peak in this ratio. So they're just now beginning to sort of have a peak in the ratio of the youth population to the population 25 to 29. But there's obviously some good news here, which is that this ratio basically begins a pretty rapid decline here in most of these countries, directly related to this notion of the demographic dividend or the window of opportunity, as we start to see the ratio of children and young people decline relative to the number of working age population. Okay. So it's high, but it's going to be going down now for several decades, even though the absolute numbers of young people will continue to increase. Growth rates may also be important. This graph is in some ways even more impressive in the sense of how different the world looks now compared to 20, 25 years ago. Again, we have a very broad set of countries here, ranging from early fertility countries to later fertility decline countries. And we can see that they all had peaks in the growth of the youth population back in the 1970s. Okay. So if we think it's growth rate that's important, that it's how fast young people are entering the labor market, how fast your secondary school population is growing, this was much worse in the 1970s in almost all of these countries than it is today. And these growth rates are now, and of course, simple math says if you're reaching a peak, the growth rate obviously has to be going down, and in fact is hitting zero in a lot of these. So from an economic point of view, it really depends on what you think the important factors are. And growth rates are undoubtedly an important issue in sort of ability of services to respond and so on. Looks a bit different in these later fertility decline countries, but even in a country like Kenya, which we saw still has high fertility, though it's been dropping, is going to have continued growth of the youth population for several more decades. The growth rate of that population has been falling very rapidly. Got incredibly high, got up to 5% a year in the 1970s. So Kenya and some of these African countries have actually been on a much bigger roller coaster in some ways in terms of how fast the population grew and then how much that's going to change as fertility falls. Now, back to this point about family size. So as I said, sort of surprising when you first hear it, but then not so surprising when you understand and think about the dynamics. Young people today come from much smaller families than their parents did. This is just data from Brazil where we happen to be able to track it very well. It's not that easy to track this, actually, unlike these other things, which you just need kind of population totals for. Here you need good micro data like a census. We go all the way back to 1960. Family size of 12 to 14-year-olds, which is what I'm using here, in 1960 was over 7, or in terms of surviving children, 5.3. We do this just by taking these 12 to 14-year-olds, matching them to their mothers. Their mothers are asked how many children they ever had and how many are still alive, standard census question. That's where these come from. And you can see how much it's fallen over time. So children who were aged 12 to 14, kind of middle school-age population in 2000, had half as many people in their family, children in their family, as those born in who were 12 to 14 in 1960. And in terms of surviving children, a 40% decline. So that's quite a big change. What you also find, what we've looked at in Brazil, is they have significantly better educated parents. They really come from a very different background. So there's enormous numbers of them, but they're actually from smaller families with better educated parents, and that certainly helps offset in terms of the economic challenges. So to summarize, we've got these very big numbers, 1.5 billion young people in the world, largest ever seen and roughly the largest we'll ever see. In most of Asia and Latin America, it is the historic peak with declines ahead. In Africa and parts of South Asia, there could be continued rapid growth. And clearly these create a lot of economic challenges on schooling, on youth labor markets, on the provision of reproductive health and other services. But there's some positive trends to offset them. We see that the growth rate and these dependency rates were actually much higher 2 or 3 decades ago. Those are actually not so bad now. Most of these countries are benefiting from this demographic window of opportunity of declining dependency ratios. And these cohorts are in many ways better off than their parents were. They're from smaller families. Their parents are better educated. They in many ways grew up in more fortuitous circumstances than previous cohorts. Okay, that's all I have. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Should I say something about the WDRs in general, or just introduce it to them?
Well, as I think most of this group will be familiar with them as a series.
All right. Just very quickly, can I hold up the? Yep. Every year the bank produces this report, and it has a different theme every year. 2007 was on agriculture, was on youth development, the next generation. 2008 will be on agriculture. 2006 was on inequality and poverty. 2009 has just been announced. It's going to be on spatial issues and urban development. And each year the bank produces this. It's partly a statistical compendium, but also it's a sort of state of the knowledge. What do we know about the characteristics, the facts? What do we know about the policies in any particular area? And this one is on youth. And this was quite an unusual one. It's never before been on a group of people. It's always been on a thing, on a policy, or on something. So this is really quite unique. Okay. All right. I will try to... I'm sorry. I'll try to restrict my talk to 4 things, although I have a lot of slides. So I'll speak quickly, and I may have to skip a few slides. First, why did we write the report? Why youth? Second, I'll talk a bit about the structure of the report, and I'll spend most of my time on the third section on what can we do, and the fourth is the sort of so what question. Now, the report is clearly much richer than I can do justice to here. It's available on the internet. I didn't bring copies of the full report. I have a few of the overview, but if anyone would like a copy of the report, I'm happy to email it to them. I have a soft copy. Okay. So, motivation. David has spoken eloquently on the demographic dividend, and the work that he did and the work that went into Growing Up Global was essential for us. We wouldn't have been able to write the report without David's contribution, without the contribution of the Growing Up Global team and the POP Council, and all the work that they did in sort of laying the groundwork, covering the ground for us. So I'll pretty much skip the demographic dividend, but we're facing now a generation of young people who have very different needs from the generation of their parents, or when most of us were young. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that to this audience. Anyway, partly we're the victim of our own past successes. Okay, young people are no longer dying in the same way that they were a generation or two ago. This is a picture of under 5 mortality per 1,000 live births, and clearly the numbers have fallen dramatically around the world. Children are surviving. Okay, children are going through primary school. The surviving childhood adolescents, they're going through primary school. Now they have very different needs. They face different challenges from the challenges that were faced by children and by young people a generation or two ago. Okay, they finish primary school, they need secondary schools. They survive infancy and early childhood, they face new health challenges. Now here's only the most obvious example of new health challenges. HIV didn't exist 20, 30, 40 years ago. Okay. This is first-generation sentinel surveillance from sub-Saharan Africa. So young people are facing very different challenges today from the ones they faced before. Here's a very different picture of the demographic window of opportunity that we're calling it. The green bars are the period in which the dependency ratio is falling. And the advantage to this is that it frees up resources that can be invested in young people. Right? We don't have to spend so much relatively taking care of older people or children because there are fewer of them relative to this population of youth. So we have more resources that we can potentially invest in this generation, this cohort of youth. Okay? Now, how do we know that this matters? There's been some research that estimates, that we commissioned for the report and that we found, that estimates that about a quarter of the growth of the East Asian tigers was due to this demographic dividend. A larger cohort of well-educated and healthy young people. Right? That governments were able to take advantage of this demographic bulge of the growth in young people because they had fewer old people to invest in, fewer children to look after. They invested in the health and in the education, the human capital of these young people, and it was, according to some estimates, responsible for a quarter of the growth in these countries in the 1980s. Now, in Latin America, they had a similar demographic change, a demographic bulge. They were not able to take advantage of the opportunity that the changing demographics had presented to them. Okay. So the question that I've given this presentation in a number of places in Africa, and to me the most important question is which model does Africa want to follow? We have the Asian model, where they were able to take advantage of this demographic dividend and invest in this bulge of young people. And the Latin American example, now clearly I'm abstracting from complications, but the Latin American model, where they weren't able to take advantage of these opportunities. No? Am I doing something wrong here? Oh, there we go. Okay. We structured the report around 5 transitions, and in each of these transitions we asked 3 separate policy questions. This is a highly stylized picture, but it is actually based on data. There is data underneath it. Young people undergo an enormous number of transitions all at the same time. They make decisions about school, leaving school, entering work, what kind of work, where to live, whom to marry, when to have children, how to engage in the wider society. All of these things, taking health risks, having sex, smoking, they undergo all these transitions all at the same time. And it's kind of a wonder that any of us make it through this period. It is kind of astonishing. So in each of these transitions in the report, we structured the report sort of thematically based on these 5 transitions. But what we wanted to do was to take a broader cut, have a slightly broader perspective, because there are things that are common, that are key to all of these transitions, all of the decisions that young people make. Okay? Now, the WDR doesn't present a recipe of policies for countries to follow. Countries are too diverse, their experiences are so different, their places in this demographic transition are so different. But instead we tried to think, right, what are the common themes? What are the things that young people need in order to develop and safeguard their human capital and make the right decisions? They need opportunities. They need the opportunity to make the right decisions. They need the capability to choose wisely from the opportunities that are presented to them. And they need second chances. For many young people, they were denied a first opportunity, or poor decisions were made on their behalf when they were young, or they made poor decisions when they were younger. And so young people need an opportunity to recover from and not to be condemned by the poor decisions or the poor outcomes or the poor environments that they faced when they were younger. Is the battery dying? Oh, there we go. Okay. So how can we help young people make better decisions? Provide opportunities, enhance capability, provide the power and the ability to make decisions, and provide a chance for remediation. We have, in this business for a long time, focused on the supply side, to use the economics jargon, providing services, okay? Providing inputs, providing things that young people need, health care, education services, and so on. With the assumption that if these services are available, if the goods are provided, people will make the right decisions and avail themselves of the right opportunities and safeguard their human capital, develop and safeguard the human capital. But now we understand that although these things are essential, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. Good health is produced not in the health clinic, but in the home and in the individual. All right? So I'm going to focus for the rest of the presentation on the capabilities and on the second chances, because we've devoted a lot less attention to these things in the past, okay, than we have on the supply side. The supply side is actually relatively straightforward. Provide a clinic. You build a clinic, provide health services. There's some discussion. You might want to target the services differently or market them differently, have youth-friendly, youth-targeted services. But that's really only a part of the story. Okay. A couple of things on opportunities. In spite of the fact that we provide primary education, and we provide healthcare, we provide services, the quality in many cases is still very low. This is a picture of the percentage of young women in Ghana and Zambia, 15 to 24, who have completed primary school, who can read a simple sentence, or who know that condoms prevent HIV transmission. Right? And it's pretty shockingly low. So simply providing the services is inadequate. The unemployment rate is a lot higher for young people than it is for older people. Now, part of this is understandable. Young people have less experience and so on. But the labor market doesn't work as well for young people as it does for older people. There's some research that I've just seen that about 2/3 of young people surveyed in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, of those who are employed, say that they got their first jobs through family connections. Now, clearly, this means that the labor market doesn't quite work. Simply providing somebody with the skills isn't enough to help their transition from school to work in early adulthood. Okay, there's more going on. Now, part of these large youth unemployment numbers are generated by policies that were introduced to safeguard workers, paradoxically. So policies that restrict labor movement affect young people a lot more than they affect older people. So there's a bit of a conflict in protecting the rights of older workers and allowing flexibility for young people to enter the labor market. This was by far the most controversial part of the report on migration. Young people the migrants are predominantly young. The preponderance of young people, of migrants are youth, are in this period. Young people want to migrate. They wanted to have the opportunity to develop their human capital, have different experiences, earn money, and most of them want to return home. And in fact, most of them do return home. Most migrants are young, and most migrants are temporary. They go for a year or two, and then they return. And there are some things that we can do to ease this process, both for young people and to facilitate the transfer of human capital, the transfer of resources to their home countries. Lower barriers to remittances, right, for instance. Again, information is important, and young people are surprisingly short of information. They lack information. This is from the demographic and health surveys, the number of young people who know multiple ways to prevent HIV transmission, which is one of UNAIDS' standard measures. In most of these are all sub-Saharan Africa. In most of them, fewer than 50% of young people know multiple ways to prevent HIV. So we still have to provide information. Information matters. This is a study from the Dominican Republic, which showed that young people are likely to underestimate the value of further education. Nice coda, sort of an appendix to this study, is that those young people who were provided the information, who were told what the value of an additional year of schooling really gets them in terms of additional wages, they are much more likely to stay in school. So simply providing the information can make a difference. But it's not enough. Okay. This is from the demographic and health surveys. The proportion of young women who know that condoms prevent HIV, and that's the dashed lines at the top. And that goes up with education. The more schooling you have, the more likely you are to know that condoms prevent HIV transmission. The solid lines at the bottom are those, same population, sexually active young women, who used a condom at last sex. It's astonishingly and frighteningly low. And what's also surprising to me is that the gap between knowledge and behavior goes up with education. So clearly having the information isn't enough. Right? It's not enough just to have the information. This is probably my favorite picture from the report. We commissioned some surveys around the world, and this is data from 8 countries for young women, although we also interviewed other people. Think about the following transitions, the following decisions: your decision to work, your decisions about school, and your decision about whom and when to marry. This is the proportion of young women who say that they themselves had the most influence on that decision. And there are a couple of things that stand out here. One is the enormous variation across countries. Right? Secondly, well, the enormous variation across subjects. Bangladesh is clearly the most obvious one. Half of young women say that they could make the decision about what work to do, but only 4% say they could make the decision about whom to marry. The third thing that stands out from this, to me, is that young people are making decisions all over the world. They are making these decisions. The picture for young men is roughly the same. The numbers are a little bit higher, but the cross-country variation is about the same. Okay. Partly it's a question of incentives. The decisions you make, the choices you make, are a function of the incentives, of what you think you will get by making a certain decision. Right? What you see, and that's partly informational, what you think will happen if you make a certain decision. And there's been quite a bit of work on this recently in the conditional cash transfers, which have been the most famous one is the Oportunidades program in Mexico, but there are others around the world. And young people respond possibly to different incentives than older people. They're much more responsive to peers, for instance, and that may be why peer education programs seem to work relatively well. They also respond to negative incentives like prices and taxes. This is the estimated impact of a 1% price increase in the price of cigarettes, alcohol, and marijuana. And clearly, young people respond quite strongly. The response is quite strong among young people to changes in prices. Now, this matters. There's a recently produced volume called the Disease Control Priorities Program, produced by the NIH, among others, and the World Bank, with World Bank assistance. Here's a simulation, some estimations on what would be the impact of a 33% price increase of tobacco. And by 2050, the authors of the chapter, the simulation, the model that they construct, they estimate that a 33% price increase of tobacco would save 60 million deaths, would avert 60 million deaths by the year 2050. Most of these in developing countries, and most of these, I have to say, in China. And a few things about second chances. Half of all of the 19-year-olds in Malawi who are still enrolled in school are enrolled in primary school. About a third or so, a little more than a third of people are enrolled, of 19-year-olds are in school, and of those, half are still in primary school. Now, clearly they have very different needs from a 10-year-old or 11-year-old who's still in primary school. Now, they were I don't know why these 19-year-olds are still in school. They were denied opportunities early on. The schools were closed or something, or they were pulled out of school. But clearly, they have very different needs than in schooling than 10 or 11-year-olds. Second chances matter in employment. We have some very good data on what are called active labor market programs, providing jobs, providing opportunities for young people who are unable to find jobs because of labor market constraints, because of whatever obstacles they face in the private labor market. AGETIP is a famous one from Senegal. They've been able to provide jobs to 35,000 years worth of, or person years worth of jobs for young people over the past 7 years. There are also programs around Latin America called the Jóvenes programs, which have been similarly successful. So these are active labor market programs, sort of, in a sense, public works programs, and they've been quite successful. And it's important to provide second chances in justice. When we were writing this, I was astonished to find that many countries have laws on the books. I think Kenya is one, and I don't know the others, can't remember the others, where they can simply jail young people for being on the street. They can lock them up for their own protection, according to the laws. There are a lot of things. Young people are arrested for what are called status crimes, things that are illegal when they're 17 but would be legal when they're 18, and they're thrown in prison. And there's been some recent work on the consequences of jailing young people with older people. One of the things they get is what the author of this paper called criminal capital. They become better criminals if they get locked up with older criminals. There's now an enormous body of evidence or experience on what are called restorative justice programs instead of retribution. The most famous of this is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but there are restorative justice programs in about 100 countries around the world. Most of these are rather small. Okay. I've taken a lot of time. I'll try to finish. Where do we go from here? This is the sort of so what question. Okay. I think there are three things that we need to do. Coordination, voice, and evaluation. Youth outcomes are improved by multi-sectoral efforts. If we go back to the transitions picture, all of these transitions are happening at the same time. but most policies are very, very narrowly focused. Voice, young people are a weak constituency, and evaluation. Much of what we are doing is motivated by anecdote, personal experience, predilection, and not on evidence. Coordination matters. There was an experiment in Kenya on providing uniforms to young women, to young people, to help them stay in school. Well, that was successful. It actually had an impact on youth enrollments. It also, surprisingly to the researchers, had an impact on pregnancy rates. Young women were much less, in the program, were much less likely to get pregnant. And that was a totally unexpected outcome of a program that was designed to increase enrollment rates. But clearly these transitions and all of these things are so intertwined. It's very hard to disentangle the policies as we usually do in this world. Voice. I was in Sierra Leone last year as part of the research for the WDR, and found that young people are much less likely to speak up at community meetings. I met youth representatives. All local councils have youth representatives, some of whom are in their 50s. So there are constraints, right, to youth participation and youth engagement. But last year, the popular music, popular culture was full of talk and songs and action on the election that's going to happen in July of this year. So a year and a half before the elections, young people were already excited about voting, about standing for office, about getting engaged in the political process. Right? And if we think about what young people can do without waiting for governments, it's kind of astonishing, right? They can agitate, they can organize, they can protest, they can work to overthrow unjust laws, unjust institutions, they can even overthrow governments. Okay. Finally, evaluation. There are some things we know, but what we know well is very, very small. Now here's just one example. We've had a generation of HIV, and we haven't really learned well from experience, at least not in a systematic way. And one of the biggest problems we had with this report, not only in health but in all the other fields, is that there are very, very few evaluated programs. I had a lot of people who said, but I know that this is the way, this is the case, this is the truth, this is what we should do. But I can't write a report on what someone claims to know. And so what we could recommend based on good, solid evaluations, good evidence, was very, very small, really, really weak. Now, again, take HIV. We looked at over 300 evaluations of youth-oriented HIV interventions. Of those, 8% had objectively measured outcomes. Of those, a third showed positive results. So 2% of the more than 300 300 evaluations that we looked at, not just interventions, but evaluations, in 2% of them could we say that the intervention had a positive impact. That's not enough, right, to guide what we do. The millions that are invested in young people around the world, the billions that are invested in development around the world. I really think we need to focus on getting good, solid evidence and having policies designed and based on good, solid evidence. A coda on the demographic window of opportunity. This is my last slide here. Now, David has gone through, has presented much of this, but here is just some examples. The green bars are the relative size of the population, and the red ones are the dependency ratio. And you can see that in some countries, China, Brazil, Vietnam, the dependency ratio is already going up. So in a sense, we've missed that demographic window of opportunity. Right? We don't have the surplus of resources. Young people have to spend much more of their time and their energy and their effort and their resources looking after others, rather than investing in themselves. Or we have less to invest in them than we might have had. In some other countries, Egypt, India, we still have an opportunity, right? The dependency ratio is still going down. And in others, this is the sort of fourth group that David was talking about, Sierra Leone is an obvious example. We still have some time, which is good because we have more to do in those countries than in others. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, terrific. Thank you both very much, gentlemen, for giving us an awful lot to chew on. And for those of you I know, particularly in the back, unless you're a youth with good eyesight, some of that's going to be a challenge. We will work with Mattias and David to get the slides on, make them available to you. But let's open it up for Q&A. And as I said, please use a microphone and let us know who you are. And, so why don't we throw it open? Who would like to start us off? John?
You want me to stand for your webcast?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
I'm John Sewell. I'm a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. I'm going to ask you two questions that perhaps the bank isn't allowed to answer. But the real concern, as a footnote, as a person who's no longer young, the issue of youth bulges has gone through various manifestations for at least 4 decades. And I started out in the Kennedy administration, and that was one of the big foreign policy interests, were school leavers, as they called them at that period of time. That doesn't mean that what you say is very useful, but the driver of concern in the rich countries comes in 2 ways, one of which is security. And Jeff's program has done an awful lot on the relationship of security, environmental change, and population growth. But it seems to me, even looking at the data, that you have both a problem and an opportunity. The problem is a large youth cohort in many countries with not necessarily very effective governments, that if they're not gainfully employed or engaged in other activity, are a time bomb and open to demagoguery and all sorts of other things. Conversely, you referred to the 25% of the East Asian tiger's growth being due to education. The figure I thought from Bird and Bloom, Nancy Birdsall and David Bloom, was 50% of the growth rates, roughly 3%, were due to investments in health and education. I'm not, doesn't matter, but the impact is big. So if you invest now in terms of economic growth, which was then distributed relatively equitably, you get a heck of a bang for the buck. And therefore it's a real opportunity. That's one question. So how do people see that, and what emerges in the volume itself that's helpful in that regard? Because it seems to me you've done an awful lot of work. Second question is, the great political worry in the industrial countries is all of those low-wage workers who are going to grow in number and compete. But what I read in what I saw with my elderly eyes on your charts was that the worry should slow down. That the youth cohort is passing through. In China and I gather in other places it's practically ended, and the growth, and so the whole composition of international trade is going to change over the next 20 or 30 years, which will lessen this concern about loss of jobs and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Shall I respond to?
Sure. Yeah, we have time to do that.
Thank you for those questions. Regarding security, we have a nice quote which comes from my co-author in the citizenship chapter from Trotsky, that if all that was necessary for rebellion is deprivation, the poor would be in rebellion all the time. So clearly, poverty and deprivation and lack of opportunities isn't all that's needed to spark a revolution. Secondly, there is some controversy about whether a youth bulge leads to violence. There's the sort of Huntington on the one side of the ledger of the argument, and some work that was done at the bank and some that we did ourselves, that it ain't necessarily so. That again, that it's possible that a youth bulge will lead to greater violence or greater crime, but so many other things have to be in place for that to happen. Right? Growth has to be going down. There has to be an economic decline in a country at the same time. There have to be rather poor institutions, as you mentioned, and so on. So many things have to be in place at the same time. I think the worry is, I don't think it's zero, but I do think that it's misplaced. I look more at the opportunity that this large number of relatively healthy and well-educated young people provides for growth and development for all of us, for the globe, right, and not just what they will do to us. And that leads to your, that leads to the third question, but let me answer the second question about growth. And part of the growth, part of the dividend comes because these people are well educated and healthy, and because there's been investment in human capital. Part of the growth, and maybe the larger part, according to Nancy Birdsall, is that it kept wages low in much of East Asia. That companies were able to hire these young people who were well educated and healthy and talented and productive for relatively lower wages than they would have otherwise had to pay had there been no youth bulge. Now, this leads to the third question about low-wage competition and demographics. I think you partly answered your own question that in many places, such as China, they're past this demographic window, and wages are beginning to rise. In China, urban wages are beginning to rise. Now, clearly, there's a second. This can lead to a second debate about urban and rural development in China, and whether it's becoming more disparate or becoming closer, whether there's a convergence, which is maybe a different discussion. Right. Thanks.
Can I just add something on that? Of course. Just to add a little bit more on the issue of on that last point, really about it has to do with security. It has to do with migration, both domestic and international, and this sort of wage pressure, which is, I think, that as my graph showed and as you were suggesting, a lot of the worst of this has already passed. And I think one of the reasons I've actually been a big advocate of sort of looking back, I mean, we kind of actually made it through this incredible 50 years of demographic change or 40 years of demographic change. And I think actually need to look back and see how amazing it was, actually, because I think even in Africa, as bad as it's done over the last few decades, these were countries all over the world in which the school-age population was doubling every 15, 20 years. I mean, incredibly rapid growth of the school-age population, of the youth labor market. And we didn't have, and most countries, schooling improved dramatically over this time. Again, Africa didn't do so great. But we didn't have massive unemployment in most of these countries. We didn't have kind of massive security problems. And those sort of pressures were far greater in the 1980s than they are now in terms of the incredibly rapid growth of these populations. So both from the standpoint of how these countries did and sort of getting everybody educated and getting them absorbed in the labor market, sort of amazing what happened in that period. What lies ahead is in many ways much easier than what was already done.
Mai?
Hi, thank you for two very interesting presentations. I'm Mai Hijazi, and I'm in the Office of Population. I had actually just some questions, if you would maybe elaborate. Mattias, you mentioned that you had been in Africa recently and given this presentation. And I'm wondering whether this issue of the demographic dividend from your trips there and as a result of this report is even on the agenda of policymakers. I mean, we can talk about it here, and you said, are they going to follow the LAC model or the Asian tiger model? But I think it takes a lot of planning and coordination. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Just briefly.
Do you have one?
Sorry.
Two-finger for that to get, yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Sorry, why was the LAC, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the difference between the Asia model and the LAC model. Why was LAC not able to take advantage of the opportunity like Asia was? If you could just...
Thanks, Rita.
Wow. That's a good question. They're both good questions and probably bigger than I can deal with. Let me deal with the Africa one first, if I may. It's easier. There is an enormous amount of concern among policymakers in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily in terms of labor markets and jobs. Where are we going to put all these young people? What are they going to do? We have a youth unemployment problem, as the figure showed. What can we do about the youth unemployment problem? And I think there are two solutions. Well, I think the real solution is long-term. It's the other work that goes on at the bank, the investment climate efforts, the reducing labor market regulations so that young people have access, can enter the labor market more easily, improving the investment climate, improving governance, and those sorts of things. But they're long-term. These are very long-term solutions. In the short term, I think it's difficult, and that's why we sort of make a break a little bit with tradition and advocate some active labor market interventions, because they do have a place, although they're unorthodox, I suppose you could say. but they do have a place. They lack active interventions to provide young people with experience and with skills and with connections and job placement assistance and so on. But that's on the supply side. On the demand side, from the employer side, say, the solutions are much more long-term. And it's about improving the investment climate, improving governance, improving transparency, reducing corruption. But like I said, these are very long-term solutions. And people all over the continent are very concerned, or policymakers are very concerned about this, and so are the young people I met are very concerned about this. You know, so we've gone through school, so what? Right? Now what do we do? You know, I went through university, but now what? I can't get a job here. Right? And partly there are some constraints that are placed on young people by young people themselves. There's famously queuing for public sector jobs. Right? And this is particularly the case in Francophone West Africa and in the Maghreb, where young people will stay unemployed, waiting for a public sector job, rather than leave the queue and enter the private sector, even though private sector jobs might be available for someone with their qualifications. Right. Why was Latin America not able to take advantage of the demographic dividend? Partly for these questions of investment climate and labor market restrictions. Labor markets are notoriously complex in Latin America. At least the formal sector labor markets are notoriously complex, highly regulated, and I think that's had a large part, responsible for the differences. Other than that, I think it's maybe a bigger discussion than we can have now. Yeah, again, these long-term questions of investment climate, transparency, corruption, investment incentives, and things like that, that employers were less willing to expand formal sector investments, to hire more workers, more young workers in much of Latin America. Again, I don't think this is true of the entire continent, but I think Brazil is a good example where recently they've been able to liberalize the labor market, especially for young people, and seen a response in youth employment and decline in youth unemployment rates.
I'm going to add one, if I may, on top of Mai's, which is picking up on one of your very first points, was the necessity for intersectoral cooperation, as opposed to our traditional. When you're having those conversations and making these presentations to colleagues in Africa, who's in the room? Is it the finance ministry folks? Is it also the health ministry? Is there the kind of broader education? I mean, who's in the room having these conversations together, and are there places where you see some of this intersectoral, even just kind of imagining the problem together and putting the solutions together?
Many countries have youth ministries, and they're usually ministries of youth and sport, and they are not often influential, right? And that's a problem. They clearly understand the intersectoral or multisectoral nature of the problems facing young people, but they don't often have a lot of influence. Now, and if other sectoral, what are called line ministries, get involved, it's often the human capital, the human development ministries, it's health and education and social welfare and that sort of thing. It becomes a little more difficult to get feedback or to have influence on those with the policy-making power, such as the ministers of finance. But to take Sierra Leone as an example, they have a ministry of youth and sport, but I think it's something like 2/3 of the population is under 35. And when I was talking in the president's office, where they were making the distinction between the problems of youth and the problems of the country, it suddenly struck me that this was an absurd dichotomy, because 3/4 of the population are youth by their definition. And I pointed this out to them, and clearly they got the irony. They understood the irony. But you're right, it is very difficult to foster this kind of coordination across sectors. I think involving, again, maybe I'm too harsh, I think involving the finance ministry isn't as difficult as getting the education and the health people to talk to each other.
Okay. Interesting. Yes, Suzanne?
Hi, my name is Suzanne Petroni. I work at the Summit Foundation here in Washington. We're a private foundation that focuses on increasing access by young people to sexual and reproductive health. And I give that as background so you know I don't work for the U.S. government nor a government-funded NGO, so I won't get in trouble for telling you. that I was tremendously impressed, as I mentioned earlier, by the bank's Chapter 5 on health and the fact that the World Bank has some very strong recommendations regarding comprehensive sexuality education, access to contraception, including emergency contraception, and access to safe abortion for young people. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the bank got to these recommendations. And when you mentioned that migration was the most controversial piece of the report, I wonder if this was controversial at all for you, including these three elements.
Happily, no. It was surprisingly straightforward. Something I didn't know before I started on the team is that the World Development Report is not an official World Bank publication. It's a staff report. And so we have a slightly freer hand than, say, we would have if we were writing a particular country report. Right? So we had a little more independence. Now, clearly, we do have to be vetted by the board and so on. But they were surprisingly supportive. I shouldn't say surprisingly. Maybe that's casting aspersions. They were supportive, right, of the report.
The report is signed by Paul Wolfowitz at the beginning.
Yes,
okay.
I know, but it is called a staff report and not an official World Bank country report or sector report. So we had a little more independence, which I was very happy with. But no, the board was supportive, and the one thing that we made very clear, and I think this is the sort of dead horse we beat throughout the report, is that everything we say has to be based on evidence. Right? This isn't simply because we happen to think it's a good idea, we might, but it's based on evidence. And we really tried to narrow down, even though it's too long as it is, but we tried to narrow down the things that we say, that we talk about, on the basis of a good, solid empirical foundation. And I think once we present the evidence, it's, I don't know if it's unarguable, but at least it's very clear how we get from A to B.
Ellen?
Ellen Starbird, Office of Population and Reproductive Health, USAID. I hope that the bank is still supportive as it moves towards approving its strategy on reproductive health of the kinds of things that were just mentioned. But my question is about equity and the extent to which you looked at equity in its role in taking advantage of this demographic dividend. It strikes me that may also be another difference between the Asian tiger's success and the Latin American failure to take advantage of it. But I didn't know whether you'd actually looked at any information about access to information across wealth quintiles or anything like that in terms of the opportunities and the second chances, et cetera.
Well, we were building on the 2006 report, of course, which was on equity and poverty and distribution. So we had that basis to build on. And we did look at access to, say, education, access to health services, and so on across wealth quintiles. Participation in certain kinds of activity across quintiles and so on. But we focused less on that than on the things that are common to young people around the world, the opportunities and the capabilities and the second chances. Again, clearly some of these are more applicable to some groups of young people than to others. But we don't have a specific distribution focus anywhere in the report. Now, clearly this is a report about poverty. This is a report about growth and welfare and incomes and poverty. In general, they all are. Right? So we take that sort of as given, but it's not specific. We don't address it specifically in the report. There isn't a chapter on income distribution or anything like that in the report.
Can I just comment on the demographic dividend and what happened in Latin America? I think I should say I haven't really been a contributor to this literature much, and I've never been completely persuaded by the estimates of the contribution to growth in Asia. But in some ways, that's really about, those analyses have really tried to look at something that was very difficult to do, which is to try to actually estimate the contribution of this sort of pure demographic change on macroeconomic growth. But if you look in Latin America and you certainly didn't see this happen in Latin America at the sort of corresponding times. On the other hand, there have been big improvements in education, and I mentioned this work in Brazil. So Brazil, at exactly the time you would have predicted that the demographic dividend would be contributing to an improvement in human capital investment, you get it. You get a big increase in education. Now, that hasn't translated into Asian-style 6% economic growth, but I think ultimately it probably will, and it has in fact been, from a distributional point of view, extremely good, because it's really been the bottom that's come up. I mean, high-income groups were always getting lots of schooling, so the big improvements of schooling have really been the poor moving much farther through school. So I think the focus on do you get sort of age structure changes turning into high rates of GNP growth per capita per year maybe misses some payoffs that actually are showing up, certainly in schooling. I haven't looked a lot at other sectors, but you definitely see it in schooling, and I guess I always have this deep down belief that ultimately giving people more schooling is going to show up with some good thing sometime, somewhere.
Okay, I think Mary had a question, and we'll move across.
Thank you, Mary Mullen. I worked with the Bosnia Support Committee. Mine is kind of a simple question. I think you said it was Brazil, when they got uniforms, then children started going to school. And always in 4 different countries that I've lived in, the uniform was the obstacle to getting into school because the parents had to spend so much money trying to get a uniform, and the uniform was inappropriate, like in northwestern Kenya, where it's like 100 degrees and 100% humidity. They had British-style uniforms, and their parents were very scantily clothed and not educated at all. It was just like 2 different worlds. And they could have used the lovely material, the lovely African materials that they use in West Africa. They could have used it in East Africa to give them a uniform, that was appropriate for that place. And so this has been something.
Which country was this?
This was Kenya. This was an experiment in Kenya. And I don't know what the uniform was. I wasn't involved in the experiment.
I think I know what it was.
But I can imagine that it was an
Yes.
English, sort of British public school.
And sometimes
kind of
it's
uniform.
even wool.
Yeah.
And they could make a uniform or a dress or something out of their beautiful natural cloth.
But even providing a uniform, which might be sort of inappropriate for the climate, had a big impact on both enrollments and then surprisingly on pregnancy rates among girls. So
even overcame the uniform.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jeff Edmates from the International Center for Research on Women here in D.C. And thank you. And I'd like to ask you to comment again, following up on the equity question. One area that we're very interested in relation to the demographic dividend is the issue of gender and gender inequality. And it seems to me that in order to harness to better harness the demographic dividend, it's best if you have as large a proportion of this bulge contributing to your economy as possible. And I guess what we see in a lot of particularly South Asian countries is women being excluded from the official financially productive portion of the workforce. And I'm wondering if you would just comment on what you feel or how you feel that will change, or how we can best move in that direction of changing it in order to better harness is this a potential policy recommendation? How would we move there?
No, I agree that it's fundamental. I agree that it's very important, and it shows up more clearly in some of the chapters than in others. I think the labor market chapter is less disaggregated than some of the other chapters, but clearly you're right. Now, and then there's a debate. I actually had a debate with someone at Dividend about whether you get more mileage out of passing laws or doing things by fiat or providing evidence that things work. I don't know what the answer is. I think that it would be best if we could do both. If we could both pass laws that discouraged gender-based discrimination or other kinds of discrimination and show that it has a real strong and positive economic impact to do so. That's the ideal. How to get there, I don't know whether you should do the policies first or the evidence first. That I don't know. But I agree that it's important. We address it explicitly in all of the chapters, but in some more than others. And I think in the health chapter, particularly in the citizenship chapter on the rights for young girls and for women, we address it explicitly. And again, I think it's less explicit in the labor market chapter, but you're right, it's important in all of these transitions.
Okay, there's a question over here.
Hi, I'm Whitney Harrelson with Making Sense International, and I was just wondering what the impact this report has had on various sectors since it's been released. If it's maybe too early to tell yet, but especially on governments, have you been seeing an increase in demand for projects, programs, loans, et cetera, at the World Bank? And with the non-governmental sectors, for example, academics, have you seen an increase in research being done in this area? And on the valuation side, as you mentioned already, and also in terms of the donor community, have you seen any increase in interest on multi-year strategies, looking at youth in different countries, and how that may be impacted over the coming years?
Within the bank, there are regional programs following on from the report. There's one in East Asia, one in Latin America. There is one in in East Europe and Central Asia. And there is one being developed in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there is quite a bit of movement, quite a bit of work within the bank in developing work programs and research programs internally to the bank. It's a slow process, of course. It's a bureaucracy, so it takes a while to get things moving. But we have an opportunity, and there are many people, even internally, who've been trying to talk about these things, who say, great, and now we have an opportunity, let's run with it, let's try to do what we can internally. Externally, the report has been very well received among donors, particularly European donors, the Scandinavians, Dividend and a few others, GTZ, and so on. And they've been very positive, and they're willing to invest more money in multi-year programs, to conduct evaluations, to invest in programs targeted towards young people. NGOs, of course, were ecstatic. They were very happy about this and have been really very positive. The report has been very well received among NGOs who have used this in negotiations with client governments. I know Sub-Saharan Africa better than I know other regions, and I know that in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, this has really provided a lot of fuel for their fires. So it's been really quite well received. So I think in general it's been very well received. There are some camps, I think, that are still a little skeptical, but we're working. Thanks.
Okay, Richard?
Richard Sincata, National Intelligence Council. Just in the answer, I thought there was more of an answer you could have given there to the gender question. And I take it from the experience of the East Asian tigers, was that when there was a large bulge, there weren't a lot of women that entered the workforce because you had so much male labor, first of all, and they were taking up they're going to take the labor first. They're going to take the jobs first. When the East-West Center found that when the decline was occurring in the workforce growth at the early years of the workforce, that then it was when women entered the workforce, and actually their fertility took another decline after that because they entered the workforce. There was that trade-off with childbearing. And the second thing that helped get women into the workforce in Southeast Asia was the type of industries. You had manufacturing sectors, particularly in electronics, that women were very good at, and now they make up over 50% of the workforce in several large sectors. Secondly, I was going to take issue with you with one point when you said that people looked at violence and even a criminality and the youth bulge, and they didn't find anything. I find that very hard to believe, because if you take a look at violent crime, even in this country, it tracks the youth bulge. I mean, there was a good paper in 1992 that showed that U.S. Violent crime was going to decline and then have an upsurge right about now. And that's happening. They projected into the future using just that youth cohort. Actually, it's 15 to 29. The reason being that is not the only thing that creates criminality or violent crime, but if you look at the tables, and I've been thoroughly impressed with this, you look at the tables of the perpetrators of violent crime across all the countries of the world, and you find that 15 to 29-year-old males make up over 85% in every country, even though there's an enormous change in the crime rate in different countries, and even within countries between race, as there is in this country. So right now, African Americans are experiencing this rapid drop in violent crime, and it's largely because of the aging of their own population and the decline in fertility among black women. Now there's enormous differences between white and black and Hispanic, but let's face it, we're not running an experiment with society. We haven't, all those things like guns and male job growth and all those things that we know that matter, we haven't changed them very much. in 30 years. So we're not running this experiment. What is changing those things is the decline in that youth bulge. And when you look, and I take your point that it is mediated, that risk of violence is mediated by governments, and that's a point that cuts across the youth bulge and violence literature. That still there's a considerable risk. I mean, it's when you look at countries that are not in civil conflict first, and you look into the next 10 years, you find them from 2 to 5 times higher than countries that have a lower proportion of young adults in the working age population. Basically, there's one other point I was going to make, but I think that that says it. I really, even though you say that the World Bank looked at this, I'm not sure that they look at it in the way that the research has looked at it. Because it's pretty convincing to me, although I did part of it. I'm convinced by, I must admit, I became more convinced, as I worked on it, particularly because of this violent crime statistics. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah. I didn't mean to say that there was no evidence, but I said that as far as we were concerned, the evidence, the question hasn't been settled yet. There is evidence on both sides. There's the Huntington sort of kind of evidence on the one hand, and then there is other evidence that says that it's at best conditional, right?
So is everything.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
So is this.
No, but that it requires that you have economic growth that's falling, and that you have weak institutions, that you have all kinds of other things that happen. So having a youth bulge in itself doesn't get higher crime.
Well, also,
yes, I said it does.
You want to distinguish
exactly
between when you have a lot of young people, you get a lot of migration, you get a lot of crime, you get a lot of things that young people do just because of But the question is, do you get more crime by 18-year-olds when there's a lot of 18-year-olds than you do when there's a small number of 18-years. So it's just, obviously when there's a lot of young people, you do get more crime.
That's
I think
the point.
Right. There was one people, right? Young people are more like young men serve in the military, for instance, right?
Exactly.
You get more young men in.
So, and you made the point that maybe you were saying about, I take your point that in Southeast Asia they did a wonderful thing. They invested in young people, and they were able to bring in capital. They were able to produce some of their own capital through savings, and thus they were turn that youth bulge into something positive. But people seem to forget that a lot of violence went along with that. It was control violence. A lot of it was on campuses. But if you look at South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, and then finally Malaysia, where the democracy had to shut down in the early years, you see that those countries were balancing on this tipping point. They had to invest and get those people jobs, but they still had this enormous surge of political unrest. Some of it in Thailand was very positive. I think this is where people think youth bulge and violence all the time, and maybe I contributed to that. But nonetheless, it's political activity and the ability. Also, you're at a stage where you're ideologically vulnerable, and then you have to look historically at the country and who's organizing, because at that point, things can become like Thailand, which was kind of mediated by the king. It can become very positive and lend itself ultimately to democracy, which had to come after the youth bulge was gone. I might remind you, they didn't really complete it. It was actually the fact that they had dissipated and you lost this kind of political energy. So I wouldn't say, the Southeast Asia, oh boy, they just did it right, because they had to weather a great deal of campus violence, labor, leftist unrest, believe it or not. I mean, South Korea was an extremely leftist movement that endured during a time of great economic progress.
I think Jamaica has a question in the back.
Hi, Jamaica Corcoran with Population Services International. And I have two quick questions on the potential of sub-Saharan Africa to harness the opportunity of the demographic dividend. Generalizing, but Africa is still experiencing a youth bulge and not necessarily a bulge in the economically active proportion of the population. And the opportunity that the demographic dividend offers relies on a substantial drop in fertility. So my question on the World Development Report is whether there's anything in the report that addresses increasing access to family planning or addressing the unmet need for contraception within Africa. And my second question is on savings and investment, which is one of the main mechanisms behind the demographic bonus. And from what I understand, there's a big difference between particularly East Asia and Africa in terms of the opportunity for savings and investment. And I'm wondering what impact that would have on the potential of Africa to reap the same benefits of the demographic dividend.
Yes, in Chapter 5, I think it is in the main health chapter, we are quite strong in our conclusions for access, arguing for access to reproductive health technology, reproductive health services, including abortion and emergency contraception and family planning, modern family planning. And so we come out very strongly in favor of access to those services and those opportunities. But we also, the main thrust of the chapter is that even where you have access to those things, you can still have high fertility, you can still have unintended and unwanted pregnancy. So there's more to it than that, more to it than just providing the services. My favorite factoid, it may not be true, I'll be happy to be proved wrong, but my favorite factoid is that half of all pregnancies in the US are unplanned. And clearly, if that's true in a case where there are no supply constraints, there's an enormous amount of other stuff going on, right, that we really don't understand. Right? All the demand side is really important. About the investment in Africa, yes, you're right. Although there was a very good paper published a couple of years ago by Bill Easterly, who used to be at the bank and is now at NYU, I think, called "It's Not Factor Accumulation." So it's more to it. There's more to the growth story than simply savings and capital. That reminds me a bit of the debate that I guess was in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Walt Rostow big push kind of debate, where the argument was all you need to do is to pour money in, sort of what Milton Friedman called helicopter money. You just sort of drop money. And clearly there's more to it than that as well. I think investment is important. I think sustained external investment is important. Private and public investment is important. But there's so much else that needs to be done on factor productivity, on institutions and so on that need to be done. So you're right that there is a lack of capital, but there's a lack of a whole bunch of other stuff as well.
Yeah, Lori?
Lori Ashford, Population Reference Bureau. So I just want to follow up on the Africa question. You didn't actually answer, will Africa follow the LAC model or Asia? And I won't ask you to, unless you want to.
I'm happy to invite, that's fine.
But of all the things that African policymakers have on their plates and all the things you have in your report, when you address a group of ministers, how do you boil it down to a manageable set of policy actions that they can take now? I mean, doesn't it just come across overwhelming and long-term? So how do you boil it down and make it immediate and doable?
Well, one thing we tried to avoid doing that in the report, and I tried to say this early on in the presentation, that we don't have specific policy recommendations, or at least not specific targeted, we don't come out in the report and say Kenya should do this and Bangladesh should do that and so on, because things are too complex. I think we tried to develop the framework that if you are going to improve the environment for young people, to use the jargon in the report, to develop and safeguard their human capital, then you need to think about these issues, the opportunities for them that are available for them, their capability for choosing wisely among the opportunities, and second chances for young people who didn't have or who went on a wrong path early on. And so we tried to keep relatively general in the main body of the report. At the end of each chapter, though, we have a matrix where we list, in very crude fashion, a set of policies within each of the transitions in labor, in health, in education, and so on. A set of policies that have been tried that seem to work well, that are well evaluated and that seem to have worked, and that have worked under a variety of circumstances. A second set of policies which may work, where there's some good evidence, it's not great, but there's some good evidence. And finally, a set of policies that, where we know fairly certainly, with some certainty, that they don't work or that they're destructive. You know, harsh imprisonment for young people, for instance, is in that third group, right? And there are some others that we can safely consign to that third group. So we do make some specific policy recommendations. But as I tried to say in the beginning, we try to develop a framework for analysis and for the development of policies, rather than make specific recommendations. I think following on from this is the really hard job, which is to do what you ask. Right, okay, so we take this report and we go to Kenya or we go to Bangladesh. Now what do? How do we apply it? And that's what we're trying to do. There's now, in the follow-on to this work, there is a plan that's been developed for East Asia within the bank, for the East Asian region within the bank. There's one that's being developed for Latin America. There's one in discussions for sub-Saharan Africa now in the region of the bank. There is one also for Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Asia. But they're very specific, right? So I have not, a couple of days ago I made a presentation in Dar es Salaam. And I didn't say this is what Tanzania should do, mainly because I don't know. Right? I haven't done enough work. I'm happy to take part in the discussions, but I don't know from what's in the report. I can't say with that certainty and specificity. But you're right. This is the hard job. Writing the report was relatively easy by comparison.
Okay. Well, I think that's where we're going to have to leave it. I think there's been an excellent set of questions from the floor, and so I appreciate you all taking the time to really come and add that dimension to the discussion and challenge our speakers. But want to thank the two of you very much for really bringing a lot for us to chew on, and I think as many of those constituencies you said received this report well, we are enthusiastic to see it, and this is filled with a room with those folks here. So we thank you both very much for discussion. Urge you to take advantage of finding a summary and the video and